Sir, step away from the vehicle. ID.
What's the problem, officer?
Suspicious behavior. Don't argue. ID.
I'll cooperate, but explain what's suspicious.
The voice came sharp and sudden, cutting through the calm of the afternoon like a blade. Sir, step away from the vehicle. Right now. The man paused. Not out of fear, out of calculation. Half a second. No more. Then he turned slowly, deliberately, making sure both hands were visible. Empty. Open. Non-threatening. He stood beside a dark sedan parked in the courthouse lot. The afternoon sun reflected off the windshield, throwing long shadows across the pavement. This was supposed to be an ordinary place. An ordinary moment. I'm standing next to my car. The man said calmly. What seems to be the problem? Officer. The officer closed the distance in 2 measured steps. His hand rested near his holster, not touching the weapon, but close enough to leave no doubt about who he believed was in control. We received a call about suspicious behavior, he said. You've been walking back and forth around this vehicle. I need to see some identification. Traffic rolled past on the nearby street. A bus hissed as it stopped at the corner. Somewhere inside the courthouse, a phone rang, mundane sounds that only made the tension feel sharper. I work here. The man replied evenly. I'm waiting for someone. Walking in a parking lot isn't a crime. The officer's jaw tightened. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the man from head to toe, as if searching for something, anything, that could justify the authority already hardening in his voice. Sir, don't argue with me, the officer said. This area has had issues. I asked for your ID. A woman exiting the courthouse slowed her steps. Across the street, a man raised his phone slightly, pretending to check a message while angling the camera toward the scene. The stop had barely begun. But in that moment, before a single document was shown, before a single law was cited, the line between routine and disaster had already been crossed. And neither man fully understood it yet. The man did not move right away. Not because he was refusing, but because he was choosing his next action carefully. Every gesture mattered now. Every second could be misread. He took a slow breath. I'm happy to cooperate, he said, his voice steady, controlled. But before I hand over anything, can you explain what exactly was suspicious about my behavior? The question landed heavier than expected. The officer's posture changed instantly. His shoulders stiffened. His expression hardened, as if a switch had been flipped somewhere behind his eyes. What's suspicious? The officer snapped. Is you standing around a government building near a high-value vehicle? The words were vague, imprecise, dangerous. A car passed slowly behind them. Tires whispered against asphalt. Somewhere close by, footsteps slowed. People were starting to notice. I'm standing next to my own car. The man replied, I work here. I'm waiting for someone. None of that is illegal. The officer took another step closer. I didn't ask for a lecture, he said. I asked for your ID. The air felt different now, thicker, tighter. What had started as a routine stop was quietly transforming into something else. If you refuse to comply, the officer continued, his voice lowering, I can detain you. I can arrest you. A woman near the courthouse doors stopped walking altogether. Across the street, a man lifted his phone higher, no longer pretending. The man did not raise his voice. He did not step back. Officer, he said evenly, threatening arrest without cause is a serious matter. I am not resisting. I am asking a lawful question. The officer exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound closer to irritation than patience. Turn around, he ordered. Face the car. Hands where I can see them. For a brief moment, the only sound was the wind brushing against dry leaves along the curb. The man complied, placing his hands on the hood. The metal was warm from the sun. His reflection stared back at him in the glass calm face. Steady eyes. Behind him, the officer muttered, almost to himself, "You see this all the time. People who think the rules don't apply to them." The man said nothing, but in his silence was something the officer didn't recognize yet. Not defiance, not arrogance. Something heavier. Something that would soon make this moment impossible to undo. The confrontation in the parking lot did not begin there. It began decades earlier, far from the courthouse. In a small Midwestern city where nothing came easily and nothing was taken for granted. The man standing with his hands on the hood of the car had grown up 2 blocks from a railroad track. At night, the rumble of freight trains rolled through the thin walls of a modest house, blending with the hum of an aging refrigerator and the soft cadence of his mother's prayers before sleep. His father worked long shifts at a factory. His mother taught public school. They taught him early that the world did not offer second chances freely, especially to boys who looked like him. From a young age, he learned to move carefully through public spaces, to speak clearly, to keep his emotions contained. Calm was not a personality trait. It was a skill, a necessary one. In school, he excelled, not because he was encouraged, but because failure was never an option. Teachers noticed his discipline. Counselors noticed his restraint. He learned quickly that being prepared was the only way to avoid being questioned. Law school came later, earned through scholarships, late nights, and a kind of exhaustion that settles deep into the bones. He studied harder than most, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. He clerked for judges who tested him relentlessly. He endured whispers about affirmative action questions never asked of his white peers. He answered them the only way he knew how, with preparation so thorough it left no room for doubt. Years passed. He became a prosecutor, then an appellate judge. He wrote opinions that reshaped sentencing guidelines. He ruled against law enforcement when the Constitution demanded it, and against defendants when the law allowed no alternative. His reputation was not built on kindness. It was built on fairness, on restraint, on principle. When he was appointed to the federal bench, there was no celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had arrived at a place he had been preparing for his entire life. And yet, standing in that parking lot with his hands resting on warm metal, none of that mattered. In that moment, he was not a judge. He was just another black man being watched, measured, and judged long before his name was ever known. The officer's story followed a different path. He grew up in a working-class suburb where respect was earned through toughness and authority was rarely questioned. His father wore a uniform. His uncles wore uniforms. Stories of the job were told at the dinner table, like legends who stood their ground, who didn't back down, who took control. Becoming a police officer was never just a career choice. It was inheritance. He joined the department young, confident, and eager to prove himself. The badge felt heavy at first, then familiar. He learned quickly how people's voices softened when they saw it, how eye contact broke, how compliance arrived without explanation. He learned which encounters ended quietly and which ones escalated. Over time, patterns formed in his mind, patterns that were never written down, never acknowledged aloud. There had been complaints. A few citizens said he was aggressive. A couple mentioned unnecessary stops. None of them stuck. Supervisors called him proactive, assertive, results-driven. Each time he walked away without consequence, something inside him hardened. He learned that instincts were enough. That hesitation was weakness. That explaining yourself meant losing ground. By the time he stepped into that courthouse parking lot, he believed one thing deeply. He was the authority. And authority, in his mind, did not need to explain itself. While one man had learned restraint as survival, the other had learned confidence without consequence. Two lives shaped by opposite lessons. Two versions of power, one quiet, accountable, and bound by law. The other loud, instinctive, and unchecked. They now stood only a few feet apart, separated by nothing more than a badge, a uniform, and a belief that control belonged to the man holding the authority. The parking lot no longer felt ordinary. It had become a testing ground, one that would soon expose which kind of power could endure scrutiny, and which would collapse the moment it was challenged. The officer stood closer now, close enough that the man could smell faint coffee on his breath, close enough that the space between them no longer felt neutral, it felt claimed. The man kept his hands flat on the hood, fingers spread, unmoving. His voice, when he spoke again, did not rise. "Officer," he said, "I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm asking you to articulate the basis for this stop." The officer scoffed. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. "Just give me your ID and we'll figure this out." "I will provide identification," the man replied evenly. "But I want it noted that I'm being detained without a clear explanation." He paused, then asked the question that officers are trained to recognize but rarely like to answer. "Am I free to leave?" The air seemed to freeze. The officer straightened his shoulders, his jaw clenched. "No," he said. "You're not free to leave. Not until I say so." A woman near the sidewalk stopped walking entirely. She pretended to search her bag, but her eyes never left the scene. A delivery driver across the lot leaned against his van. Phone raised openly now. Recording without disguise. Detaining someone requires reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. The man said calmly, "Standing near my own vehicle does not meet that standard." The officer's face flushed. "There it is," he snapped. "You think you know the law better than me. I know the law." The man replied quietly. That was enough. The officer raised his voice just slightly louder than before. Loud enough for the bystanders to hear. "Sir, you are being uncooperative. If you continue to resist, you will be arrested." "Resisting what?" "Exactly," the man asked. Still standing, perfectly still. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. "This is crazy. He hasn't done anything." The officer noticed the phones now. The attention. The eyes. What had started as suspicion had turned into something else entirely. This was no longer about safety. It was about control, and the officer was no longer willing to let it slip. The officer reached up and pressed the button on his radio. "Dispatch," he said. Voice clipped and rehearsed. "I've got a non-compliant subject refusing to identify himself. Possible attempt to evade." The words hit the air like gasoline. A reaction rippled through the small crowd that had formed almost without anyone noticing. "He's not doing anything." Someone said, louder this time, "He's just standing there." The officer snapped his head toward the sound. "Sir, stay back," he barked. "This does not concern you." A man in a suit near the courthouse steps raised his voice. "It concerns all of us when you threaten arrest without cause." The officer ignored him. His focus narrowed. His grip on control tightened. The man at the car spoke again. Softer now, but firm. "Officer, I suggest you call a supervisor before this goes any further." The suggestion landed like an insult. "I don't need a supervisor to do my job." The officer snapped. You people always think you can talk your way out of things. The words hung in the air, heavy, unmistakable. A woman across the lot let out a short, stunned laugh. Did he really just say that? Phones rose higher. No one was pretending anymore. The man closed his eyes briefly. Just for a moment. Then he opened them again. He did not react to the comment. He knew better than to take the bait. Instead, he focused on what mattered now, preserving evidence. Witnesses. Himself. Officer, he said. Calmly. Deliberately. I am asking you one last time. What crime do you believe I am committing? The officer hesitated. Just for a second. In that pause, doubt flickered across his face quick. Almost imperceptible. Then it vanished. Buried under pride and pressure. Suspicious behavior, he said finally, and refusal to comply. The man nodded slowly, as if filing the words away, as if committing them to memory. Around them, the crowd had grown to nearly a dozen people, some angry, some confused, all watching. The tension was no longer private. It was public, recorded, witnessed, and boxed in by his own authority and the eyes of strangers. The officer felt the walls closing in. He made a decision, one driven not by law, but by ego. And once made, it could not be undone. The officer did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Turn around, he said. Hands behind your back. The words were flat, rehearsed, final. For a brief moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the man complied. He turned slowly, gravel crunching beneath his shoes. Every movement was measured, deliberate. His hands moved back, fingers interlacing exactly as instructed. The officer stepped in close. The cuffs came next. Metal on metal. The click was loud, too loud, echoing off the concrete walls of the parking structure. Sharp, unmistakable. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Cold steel closed around the man's wrists. Tighter than necessary. Not enough to draw blood. Enough to remind him who, in that moment, claimed control. You are being detained pending investigation, the officer said. Any further resistance will result in additional charges. The man said nothing. His jaw tightened for just a second, then relaxed. His eyes dropped briefly to the ground, studying the cracks in the pavement as if committing them to memory. Inside his mind, everything moved faster than the scene unfolding around him. Time, witnesses, video angles. This is wrong, a woman said, her voice shaking but firm. He didn't do anything. The officer ignored her. He placed a firm hand between the man's shoulder blades, not violent, not gentle, deliberate, guiding, controlling. Each step toward the patrol car felt heavier than the last. The back door opened. Plastic seat. No handles. No escape. The man ducked his head and slid inside. The door shut with a hollow thud. Outside, the officer stood for a moment, hand resting on the door. His chest rose and fell faster now. He glanced at the crowd, then away. He had crossed the point of no return. Whatever doubts had crept in earlier were buried now beneath procedure and pride. Inside the car, the man sat upright, wrists bound, shoulders squared. He did not feel anger. He felt clarity. He knew exactly what had happened, and he knew exactly how this would end. The patrol car pulled out of the parking lot without urgency. No sirens, no lights, just the low hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of passing streets. Inside the back seat, the man sat upright, wrists cuffed in front of him now, resting calmly on his knees. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old sweat. Layered with the ghost of fast food, he stared straight ahead through the metal grate. Separating him from the front seat, neither man spoke. 12 minutes passed like that. 12 minutes of blinking dashboard lights. 12 minutes of intersections and red lights. 12 minutes where one man replayed a stop that had gone too far, and the other quietly assembled a legal framework in his mind piece by piece. Unlawful detention. Lack of reasonable suspicion. Escalation without cause. At a red light, the officer glanced at the rearview mirror. For the first time, he really looked. The man in the back seat didn't look angry, didn't look afraid. He looked composed, still, watching. A flicker of unease passed through the officer. He looked away. The station came into view brick. Fluorescent. Unremarkable. The kind of place where mistakes are supposed to be contained, processed, forgotten. Inside, the air felt heavier. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A wall clock ticked loudly. Each second stretched thin. The man was guided to a hard bench near the booking desk. The cuffs stayed on. The officer filled out paperwork with more force than necessary. His pen pressed hard against the paper. He avoided eye contact. "What's the name?" the desk sergeant asked without looking up. The man answered clearly, precisely. No hesitation. Keys clacked against the keyboard. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sergeant paused. He leaned closer to the screen, typed again slower this time. The room seemed to hold its breath. "1 moment," the sergeant said quietly. He stood and walked toward a door marked "Supervisors Only." The door closed softly behind him. The officer felt it then. That subtle shift in the air, the kind that comes just before everything changes. The room stayed quiet. Too quiet. The officer shifted his weight slightly. The faint squeak of his boots loud against the tiled floor. He glanced toward the door, marked "Supervisors Only." Then away. His jaw tightened. The man sat on the bench, back straight, hands still cuffed, resting calmly on his knees. His expression was unreadable. Not defiant, not triumphant, just patient. Minutes passed. The door opened. A lieutenant stepped out, followed closely by the desk sergeant. The lieutenant's face was composed, professional, but his eyes carried something else. Urgency. Caution. He did not look at the officer first. He walked directly to the man on the bench. "Sir," the lieutenant said carefully, lowering his voice, "I need to confirm something. Could you state your full name again?" "Please." The man did. Clearly, precisely, without hesitation. The lieutenant nodded once, then turned sharply toward the officer. "When did you detain him?" he asked. The officer swallowed. "In the courthouse parking lot," he said. "Suspicious behavior." The lieutenant repeated the words more slowly, this time. Suspicious behavior. He turned back to the man. "Sir," he asked, choosing each word carefully, "are you currently serving on the federal bench?" The room went still. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. "Yes," the man replied. "United States District Court." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed. The officer felt them hit before his mind fully caught up. His stomach dropped. The color drained from his face. Federal court. The lieutenant closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again. He took a deep breath, the kind taken when a situation has already gone very wrong. And there is no way to rewind it. The cuffs came off immediately. Metal loosened. Pressure released. "I apologize." "Judge," the lieutenant said, "this should not have happened." The officer stood frozen. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His hands trembled just enough to notice. He stared at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but at the man he had threatened with arrest. The judge stood slowly, rubbing his wrists once, not dramatically, just enough to restore circulation. He looked at the officer now, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with disappointment. "You had every opportunity to stop this," he said quietly. "Every opportunity." No one spoke. The balance of power had shifted completely, and there was no way back. The judge left the station without ceremony. No raised voices, no demands, no speeches. He picked up his jacket, nodded once to the lieutenant, and walked toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open. Night air rushed in, and just like that, he was gone. Behind him, the officer remained frozen. In a matter of minutes, his authority had evaporated. Everything he thought, he controlled the stop. The detention. The arrest had collapsed under a single name check. But the consequences didn't stay inside the station. By the next morning, the footage was already online. First, a short clip, shaky, but clear enough. A uniformed officer, a calm black man, raised voices, handcuffs, bystanders protesting as the patrol car pulled away. By noon, a longer video surfaced, clear audio, multiple angles. The moment the officer said suspicious behavior, the moment he threatened arrest, the moment the cuffs clicked shut. The caption was simple: "Federal judge detained outside courthouse." Local news picked it up within hours. By evening, national outlets were calling the department's press office non-stop. Legal analysts replayed the footage frame by frame, pausing on each decision point, each procedural failure. Civil rights attorneys dissected the stop with surgical precision. There was no gray area, no ambiguity, no plausible defense. The department issued a brief statement. An investigation was underway. Details were limited. No one believed that would be the end of it. Inside the city's legal department, attorneys watched the video in silence. They noted the lack of reasonable suspicion, the refusal to call a supervisor, the escalation, the arrest without cause. One of them finally spoke. "This is indefensible." And everyone in the room knew it, because this wasn't just a bad stop. It was a public record of power misused, and now, power would answer to the law. 2 days later, the lawsuit was filed. Not quietly, not vaguely, but with precision. Unlawful detention, false arrest, violation of Fourth Amendment rights. Every claim was backed by evidence timestamps from video footage, witness statements, dispatch logs, departmental policy manuals. The complaint read less like an accusation and more like a reconstruction of inevitability. The city's legal team reviewed it in silence. They watched the footage again and again. They noted the moment reasonable suspicion should have ended and didn't. The moment a supervisor should have been called and wasn't. The moment ego replaced judgment. Internal Affairs opened an investigation the same week. Not behind closed doors. Not quietly. Public pressure ensured transparency. Body camera audits were pulled. Dispatch recordings reviewed. Prior complaints against the officer resurfaced, ones that had once been dismissed as isolated incidents, now forming a pattern impossible to ignore. Aggressive tone. Unnecessary escalation. Stops that ended without charges but not without consequences for the people stopped. This time, they stuck. The officer was placed on administrative leave, then terminated. The language in the dismissal letter was clinical. Final. Violation of constitutional rights. Conduct unbecoming of an officer. Failure to follow department policy. Loss of public trust. There was no appeal. The city moved quickly after that. Settlement negotiations began before the case ever reached trial. The amount was never officially announced, but sources confirmed it was substantial enough to make a statement. Enough to ensure the case would be remembered in briefing rooms and training halls for years to come. Reforms followed. Mandatory bias training. Revised stop and detention protocols. Supervisor approval required for certain encounters. Body camera audits conducted monthly instead of annually. The department issued a public apology, not just to the judge, but to the community. The system had been forced to look at itself, and this time, it couldn't look away. The judge never gave an interview. He didn't appear on television, didn't write an op-ed, didn't hold a press conference. He returned to the bench quietly, continued hearing cases, continued writing opinions, continued holding the law to the same standard he always had. The case, however, did not fade. The video was used in law schools, in police academies, in civil rights seminars, not as outrage, but as instruction. It became a reminder that authority does not replace the Constitution, and that power, when it refuses to explain itself, becomes dangerous. Under the Fourth Amendment, law enforcement officers are required to have reasonable suspicion of specific criminal activity before detaining someone. Reasonable suspicion is not a feeling. It is not a hunch. It must be based on articulable facts. Standing near a vehicle is not a crime. Walking in a parking lot is not a crime. Asking why you are being detained is not resistance. Silence is not obstruction. Courts have been clear on this for decades. What this case exposed was not a misunderstanding but a pattern. How vague language like suspicious behavior becomes a blank check when accountability is absent. How implicit bias fills in gaps where facts should be. How calm is mistaken for arrogance. And questions are treated as defiance. And perhaps most unsettling of all, if a federal judge can be handcuffed for standing in the wrong place, credentials are not the shield we think they are. The law is only as strong as its enforcement. And enforcement without accountability is not justice. This story is not about one officer. It is not even about one arrest. It is about vigilance, about knowing your rights, about demanding that power explain itself. Because the Constitution does not protect people selectively. It protects everyone, or it protects no one.